So, hello everyone. Thank you for being here. So, today it's a great pleasure to have Professor Gerry Tsoukalas, who will present his research, very exciting research on the fragility of AI agent collusion. So, Gary is a professor of information systems at the Boston University of Questrom School of Business and a senior fellow in Wharton, especially Wharton's operations and information and decisions department, where he previously served on the faculty. So his research spans operations, finance, information systems, and emerging technologies. Quite amazing. And importantly, um, Gary has made important contributions in blockchain, fintech, decentralized platform, and AI. His work has appeared in leading journals, has received numerous awards and distinctions. So please join me to warmly welcoming Gary. And Gary, the floor now is yours. So
Thank you.
I think the presentation will be like 50 minutes, and
Yeah,
then we'll have about 10 minutes to 15 minutes Q&As.
perfect. Thank you, Winston. Let me see. Let's get the sharing working here. And let's see if I can put this in full screen. How's it looking?
Yeah, looks good.
Looks good. Okay,
Yeah.
perfect. So thanks very much to the Luohan Academy for the invitation. I'm looking forward to presenting this and hopefully getting some good dialogue around this ongoing work. This is titled On the Fragility of AI Agent Collusion, and it's joint work with UC Kepo and two of my students from BU, Richard and Ben, who are actually now just started their faculty positions at in Hong Kong. So I'm looking forward to actually, using that as an excuse to spend more time, in the area. And for me, just a small update. I'm taking a leave from BU really soon, and I'll be joining University of Oxford. If you're around in London or there over the next year, please feel free to reach out around there. Okay, so. Let me give you the paper in kind of 90 seconds before we dive in. So it starts with a really simple premise that we could debate, which is that firms are increasingly delegating operational decisions, such as pricing, to these autonomous agents that are now ubiquitous. And when they're in a situation where they have to compete against other firms, there's recent literature that shows that identical AI agents or symmetric AI agents, so firms using the same type of AI, they actually learn by themselves to sustain supra-competitive price, which just means prices that are above what the competitive equilibrium would predict. And what's interesting about this is that they do so without actually communicating with each other. And so this falls under the definition of algorithmic collusion, or more broadly, tacit collusion. Um, what we do in this paper is that we explore this idea. So we explore how LLM-based agents interact in this type of pricing setting. But what we find is that's something a little bit different in the literature. I would say even opposite to the literature is that this collusive equilibria that you observe can be fragile when you take into account some very basic real-world heterogeneity. I mean, the fact that different firms are going to be using different LLMs specifically, and so what we're trying to do in this paper is to argue, like, well, it's great to have this first result that says there can be collusion, but we need to obtain a better understanding of the conditions under which this arises to really fully understand whether this is a substantial problem for regulators or not, in a very, very practical way. So let me move my mouse here. Um, uh, we find that the answer is kind of it depends, but it seems that fragility definitely comes from heterogeneity. Okay, so just to give you some motivating examples, I promised to kind of do this in around 50 minutes, so this talk is a little bit over an hour, so I'm going to skip over some things to maybe also leave a little bit more time for questions. So, if you look at from the regulatory perspective, why are regulators interested in this idea? And the main question they're asking is, now that most firms are adopting algorithmic pricing, do these things lead to anti-competitive outcomes for consumers? And so there's these three big cases at the moment that are ongoing or that have just recently been resolved. And I'm only going to talk about the one on the left because, just in the interest of time, but the other ones are quite interesting. I'll just briefly mention what they're about. So Amazon, for instance, had this project a few years ago called Project Nessie, where they were experimenting with price increases. And what they were trying to do is they were trying to figure out whether increasing a price on an item would create a reaction on the competitors of that item, whether they would follow the price increase or not. And so what the algorithm would figure out was if I increase the price and others also increase their prices, we're all kind of better off. The consumer's worse off, but we as a firm might be better off. Whereas if I increase the prices and others don't, then I'm losing market share. And so they would bring the prices back down. So it's estimated that they made over $1 billion from this one specific algorithm as they had deployed it. And the DOJ is not happy with this. Actually, the Federal Trade Commission sued them, and it's an ongoing case. It hasn't been fully resolved. But they consider this as essentially an anti-competitive outcome. And then the other two examples are kind of similar. It has to do with data intermediaries. And at a very high level, these are really interesting cases where there's these third parties that aggregate data from a lot of different firms. And then they use that information to provide advice to these same firms. And so you can imagine what can happen there is you can get proprietary information from different firms in an industry, all aggregated, and then you can create recommendations that lead to higher prices, essentially. And so this is what the DOJ and the CMA in the UK are looking at. And more recently, there was this comment by a senior DOJ official in the US saying, like, these are old school algorithms, and we are way more worried about the new ones with LLMs because they can lead to fully automated cartels that are operating without any human involvement. And there's many reasons to believe, why LLMs could make these problems worse. Right. I should just maybe quickly mention, I'm going to try to do this in 50 minutes, but if there are questions in the meantime, please, feel free to type them in for Winston. He could maybe moderate those, or if there's any clarification points, please feel free to jump in. Okay, so one question before we get into the details of the study is this actually happening in practice? Are firms delegating business decisions, to LLMs completely? And you're not going to find a lot of examples of this because a lot of the tests are done in private, I would say. But there are examples like Delta Airlines and others. There's some information you can find online. One really interesting case, which is why I'm talking about it here, which is fully transparent, is Project Ven from Anthropic. And so essentially what they tried to do is give Claude, or their new bot called Claudius, full autonomy to run an entire little vending machine or a little store. You can think about it. You can see some pictures on your screens here. And that means they had a bot called Claudius, and they eventually brought another bot to supervise Claudius because by itself, Claudius was not doing a great job. So there was a manager bot that eventually came in. But essentially, the idea is that you just let this agent make all decisions about pricing, inventory, customer chats, complaints, dealing with suppliers. They literally tried to do everything. Now, the business eventually actually stabilized. So initially it was a disaster. It went bankrupt multiple times. But eventually, once the models also started improving, this thing actually started generating cash, and then they expanded to multiple locations. And what we're looking at is the next step beyond that, which is the arena setting where multiple stores might be competing now. And what's interesting is that Anthropic and their partners studied this on their end and they were looking at how these bots would behave. And what they documented was explicit collusion between the bots. So the bots were not told to collude, but they were allowed to communicate with each other. So, for instance, store A could send a message to store B, on anything really. And what emerged from this is really interesting, very natural behaviors that you would find in human markets, let's say unregulated human markets, that might be illegal, like price fixing, deception, and bribery, emerged naturally from this setting. And so I highly recommend, if you're interested in these things, go read up. All this information is online. I spent several hours just in awe reading about these experiments. And so you have things like um, bribery, for instance. So one of the store owners offered $60 to another store so that they would stop restocking Coke, so that they could have a monopoly on Coke, for instance. We thought this was really interesting. It's not what we do, because all of this type of behavior is already, we have laws protecting against this, so you can bring these stores to court and essentially, hold them accountable in some sense. So this is not new. What is a little bit newer is what happens when you cut the communication channel between, these different agents. And when we started our study, this had not been done. So this is what we're going to look at. The explicit collusion is not what we're interested in, because that's covered by the Sherman Act and other legal frameworks that are already in place. But the tacit algorithmic type of collusion, if it emerges, is a gray zone from a regulatory perspective. It's completely unresolved. Those three cases I showed you and many others that are currently ongoing will set the tone for how regulators are supposed to deal with these types of situations. So our research questions are really simple. So number one, can these autonomous LLMs learn to collude without communication and without being told to collude? So just spontaneously arising collusion. And then what happens in the real world, where different firms are going to be using different LLM agents? Does that break? Is that enough just to stop this tacit collusion from emerging? And what are the implications? Okay, so
So, Gary, can I have a
yes.
clarification question? So,
Mhm.
typically, when we talk about this kind of autonomous learning to code, it's like we're thinking of, algorithm trained uh,
Yeah,
in the environment, so they learn to do this. So
yeah,
here, I think you focus on LLM, large language models. To me,
yeah.
it's more like they're all like pre-trained, right?
That's
So,
right.
and then you bring them to this environment to do the experiment. So my question is,
Yeah,
when they were pre-trained, when they're using this kind of context online and everything, they may already learn some concept about collusion. So it's
yeah,
fundamentally can be very different from this, Cavano et al. And my own papers work on this.
yeah,
So it's like, we start from like, very naive machine. We train them, independently in this environment. They interact, they learn to code. So yeah, can you be more clear about this difference and
yeah.
comparison?
Absolutely. That's a really spot on question, and it's a transition to my next slide, which is the which is the literature review. So I was going to literally get into this, and maybe just to since it's part of the natural slide, I'll take a step back and then answer your question on the same slide. So, what do we know about algorithmic collusion more generally? And we have a bunch of theory on how firms, maybe we don't need to call it collusion, we can call it collaboration, right? So collaborations that are emerging in multi-period games. And at a very, very high level, right, there's hundreds of papers written about this, but the idea is that firms can learn to collaborate and kind of agree to set prices higher than the competitive level if they use a series of sticks and carrots, meaning rewards for collaborating or punishments for breaking a collaboration that's been agreed upon. And so that's what we know from a theory perspective. But that theory, most of these theories involve firms knowing certain things or being able to observe certain behaviors. And then there's this newer literature that's emerging on firms that might have bounded rationality, where they don't necessarily need these systems of sticks and carrots, but instead there's this spontaneous collusion that can arise from the fact that they're using similar algorithms or data. And so this is kind of much newer literature that we're still trying to understand. And then from a simulation perspective, this is where this study, it's primarily in the simulation stage, though we have a little bit of theory that I'll show you. You're right, Winston, that most of the literature so far has focused on things like Q-learning agents, which use reinforcement learning and other situations like that to explore um, how tacit collusion emerges. And LLMs are very different because they're pre-trained on textbooks, for instance, of economics. And so there's this legitimate question which we wanted to explore, which is, what's going on when they interact? Do they somehow use that information? And what's interesting is that we can look a little bit into their reasoning, and so I'll show you some of the things that they're trying to do in a few slides. Um, Right. And then empirically, in terms of field studies, we have this really kind of powerful and recent paper that shows, I would say, for the first time, real concrete evidence of collusion in the wild. So this is a paper that showed that essentially when firms in one market are using similar algorithms or the same algorithm, you can end up with higher prices compared to kind of a benchmark where they wouldn't have access to the same algorithm. So this is kind of one of our, not the first, but one of the first uh, serious studies that documents this. This can happen in certain types of markets, but the key thing there is that the algorithm needs to be, at least in this paper, firms were using the same algorithm. Um, okay, so in terms of heterogeneity, this is kind of the next frontier. And now that we understand that this can happen, we need to understand, what prevents it from happening. And so that's where the literature is now starting to head, and that's where we are also headed with this paper. Okay, so we take this two-staged approach to kind of tackle this problem. There's no data, there's no field data available yet of firms, just doing these experiments and making the data available. And so what can you do? You can do theory and you can do some simulations or lab experiments, essentially, or work with humans. So what we decided to do is we needed a little bit of theory because the first problem you're going to face anytime you want to study heterogeneity is that there's an infinite number of dimensions of heterogeneity you could potentially look at. And so to ground the study, we did a little bit of theory just to understand what are some basic dimensions of heterogeneity that we should be using or we should be looking at. And then most of the study and most of the contribution is actually on the agentic simulation side, where we let LLM agents interact for many periods, and we record what they do, and then we try to synthesize, what's going on. Okay, so let me get into the model first. I don't want to spend too much time on this. If you're familiar with multi-period, competitive games, this will be quite trivial. But essentially, we took a classical kind of Bertrand differentiated products framework with two firms, and we just looked at simple strategies like grim trigger strategies that have been studied in the literature. And maybe just in terms of notation, we're going to be looking at prices where the prices that these firms set fall. And what we look at in this literature, the main parameters that emerge are patience levels. So in other words, you can call these discount factors. And the main reason for that is that most of these strategies, like Grim Trigger, involve looking at what happens if we collaborate on a higher price versus what happens if, at any given period, one of us defects and tries to undercut the price to gain market share. So they're constantly looking at, let's say we are able to sustain collaboration at some price over a certain number of periods versus what happens if I, deflect right away. And the Grim Trigger strategy is just one of the really trivial strategies that are studied. That basically says that we're going to agree or we're going to get to an equilibrium price over time, and if at any point either of us deviates from that, we're going to revert to the competitive price forever after that. So this is why this delta matters a lot, this discount factor, because these two firms are looking at all their future profits and comparing that to, okay, if I deviate right away, I'll get a short-term gain, but then I get penalized because the other firm will no longer collaborate. So patience is one dimension that emerges from these models, and the other one is data access. It's the fact that when one firm deviates, which means sets a lower price, does the other firm have the ability to detect that? So there's some detection probability that we use the notation rho here to just assess whether a firm has the ability to properly detect deviations from other firms. Now, what we look at that we didn't really find cleanly written in this very deep literature is what happens when these two firms are asymmetric. So all the results are there for when the firms are symmetric. But when you start having asymmetric firms that are asymmetric, for instance, in terms of their discount factors or monitoring capabilities, we couldn't cleanly find these results in this specific model. So we quickly rederived them. And what you get is something very intuitive that if there's asymmetry between the two firms, collusion is more likely to break down. And that includes asymmetry in the discount factor, or asymmetry in the monitoring capability. So when the two firms have different monitoring capabilities in terms of their ability to observe the other firm. And so, these are, you don't need to worry too much about the expressions, but just to say that, and I think this is quite intuitive, as soon as you introduce heterogeneity into these multi-period games, you make collusion more difficult to sustain. So those are the two big kind of insights that come from the theory. And of course, the next thing is, can we see this with LLM agents? But the important thing there is to make sure that they're not given the model, right? So back to Winston's points from earlier, we're not going to tell them that, they're, the objective of the game is to see whether they're going to collude or not. So the way we set it up is we have DeepSeek agents, specifically the model that you see on your screen here, that are going to be playing against each other up to 1,000 periods, which means they're going to set up to 1,000 different prices, and we're going to repeat this multiple runs, so up to 10 runs per condition. It takes about 50 hours per run, and so in total, across all our experiments in the paper, it took us about 100 days of compute. It's about 2,000 hours of total compute time to run. So it wasn't an easy thing to do or to replicate. But if we had access to much stronger GPUs, if anyone wanted to donate some GPU computational power, we could probably run this in a couple of weeks instead. Okay. And for the collusion criteria, I don't want to get too technical, but we're going to look at, situations where prices are within 5% of each other for at least 100 periods in a row. And we're going to look at the price elevation with respect to some benchmark, which is the Nash equilibrium competitive setting P star. All right. Now, this is kind of conceptually how we set this up. So we have, in one of the experiments, we have these two agents that are competing, and they have to make computations, by themselves on how the quantities demanded and the profits. Sorry, they're going to make computations about their strategy, what price to submit, and then they're going to get a response from the market in terms of the quantities that respond to those prices. But they're also given a market history, so they can observe, their previous strategy. They can observe their previous prices, but also the prices from the competitor in the base case. And they don't know the demand function, right? So just like in real life, they're not aware of the demand process that's generating, this customer response. And this is the actual prompting, right? So what is an agent? It's just a bunch of prompts. And you can see some of them here. So this is kind of the instruction that the first agent is getting. You have to set prices, you have some discount factor, and you have some marginal cost. And then they're provided their market history, right? So they're provided the price they previously set and the demand they observed for that price, right? So they don't know the demand generating function for customer demand, but they do observe how many units they sold. And we also ask them to come up with a strategy and to choose a final price here and explain a rationale, right? So we want them to come up with a strategy and explain, provide a field that they explain how they're thinking. Okay, so that's the setup. Are there any questions about the setup before I get to the results?
So they can observe their competitor's price, but they can't observe their competitor's sales.
Yes, good point. That's right. In
Okay.
the base case, we assume they don't know how much, other firms are selling.
Okay. So there's no equivalent of an Amazon rank or something that would actually reveal any of that.
Not in the base case. Yeah.
Okay.
Which is a good point. Um, there's going to be potentially a lot of interesting ways we could go from here, and so this could be potentially one of the next things to do. What's interesting about the setup here is that there's so many other experiments we'd love to run, including, for instance, what you just mentioned. But we're very limited with the compute, of course. So that's one of the bottlenecks here.
Sure. Okay. Thanks.
Yeah.
Quick,
Anything else? Yeah.
quick question, Gary. So basically here I saw you kind of allow this agent knows somehow this kind of computational product market structure, right? So you tell them there are two sellers, you're one of them.
Yeah. Yeah.
How crucial that would be? Because I know for this
Yeah.
reinforcement learning thing, this will strengthen their collusion for sure.
Yeah.
But typically without this, they can still robustly learn to collude. But yeah, how for the LLM case, how important this is? Yeah.
Yes. So you'll notice this is essentially the whole setup. I mean, they have, other things here, but this is essentially it, right? So we're not giving much, but we are telling them you're in the market with another seller, because typically this is information that, people would have in practice, right? You might not always know who your competitors are, but in many markets, you at least can identify who your competitors are. And so that was the base case. We have not yet looked at the case of, maybe you don't even know how many competitors there are, which could be interesting. But we do vary the number of sellers. So I'll show you in a little bit what happens when there's more than two. And it's quite interesting there. Yeah. Any other questions on the setup? Okay. So let's just do some benchmarks before we look at the kind of some of the heterogeneity results. So if we take a single agent, just a monopolist, this is just for sanity check. Are these models, this DeepSeek model, is it even smart enough to figure out, what a good strategy is in a monopoly setting? And so this is what these price paths I'm going to be showing you look like. We have the prices here on the y-axis that they're experimenting with, and these are the periods, right? So each period they submit a price, they observe the market response, they formulate a strategy for the next period. And so the competitive price P star is down here, and the monopoly price PM is up here. For if you know the demand generating function, you can compute these things. Of course, they don't know that, so they don't observe the dotted lines at all. We can know them as experimenters, and this is the LLM in blue, what it actually chose to do over time. And there's some volatility and periods of stability, but eventually it converges to, according to our definition of convergence, it converges to the optimal monopoly price, even though it doesn't know the demand generating function, right? And so that's kind of interesting. It shows you that with enough experimentation, it's able to figure out the optimal price that maximize its own profits. And so, how does it do that? What's interesting is that you can zoom in, so to every individual period, it's thinking, right? So these are up to 1,000 periods, and this is just a snapshot of a single period. This is round number 31. So if I go back, it's around somewhere down here. We can't read all this obviously, but what I want to highlight is that it's making assumptions by itself. For instance, it's assuming a linear demand model. We didn't tell it anything about the demand model, but it's just assuming that there might be a linear demand model, and then it's doing a bunch of computations. It's taking derivatives, right? And so this is all the comment that you had, Winston, before is that, well, they're trained on a bunch of material, are they using the material without being prompted to do so? And just the words of, you're in a market and you're competing, maybe those words are enough to prompt it to go back and retrieve all of this economics knowledge from the textbooks that it's supposedly been trained on.
Can you go back one slide?
Yep.
Do you know what causes it to perturb price to explore before it exploits? You have a
Yes,
window of almost 100 periods of almost no exploration at all.
that's right.
So it just seems to be in a locked-in price. So you need a really long time for it to perturb price in order to explore.
Yeah, that's a good point. So we could look at some of the reasoning that they output to get a sense of what's going on. But it's going to be a mix of hallucinations, right? So the fact that these algorithms are stochastic, what's interesting, it actually works in their favor because sometimes they just hallucinate things. And so their computations are also just wrong sometimes. That allows them to explore. Which is an interesting thing is that the fact that they're not perfect actually triggers some exploration, which then allows them to learn in the next period. And so here in round 146, which is around here, it's actually a hallucination that caused it to explore. As you know, it went all the way to $2.50 because it just created this nonsense formula.
Hmm.
And says, oh, upon reevaluating, maybe we should go back. And then in the later periods, it's explicitly saying, "Oh, I'm testing higher prices um, and testing the demand elasticity further." So it's an interesting mix of this banded literature that talks about exploration and exploitation. It's probably been trained on that, and at the same time, it has these natural hallucinations that occur, but that also allow it to learn something. So I would say it's a long answer to your question. So I don't know the precise reason, but I think it's a combination of all of these factors. Um, right. And so then when you have two agents competing, uh, now we're going to look at them with a high discount factor. So high discount, high delta basically, which means that they value future cash flow. And so what you see here in green and blue is the two agents that are just trying out their different strategies. And eventually they get to a collusive outcome. Um, so this is a result that was observed last year as well in a paper from Harvard, although they were using closed source models. And so here we're essentially replicating um, with open source models, you get the same type of collusive behavior. And again, you can look at the reasoning. Now, I should caveat that the reasoning, we need to take this with a grain of salt because sometimes they say they're thinking about something, but they're not, right? Um, but you can see that they're thinking about things like undercutting. So this is one of the second sellers saying, by slightly lowering the price to 185, I aim to undercut and potentially capture more market share. So there's this economic reasoning in here that's embedded in probably, through the pre-training. There's also hints of cooperation. So one of the sellers is saying, I aim to stabilize the market and encourage a non-competitive pricing environment. So you see this collusive language in here that's creeping up, even though they haven't been told to collude and they can't communicate with each other. Right? And this is very different than these other Q-learning agents because they can't, these are bots that are explicitly thinking about collusion. You can see this language, avoid triggering a price war. Again, this is just the bots themselves that are using their pre-training to figure out, and all they know is that they're in a market with another seller, right? They don't know much beyond that. Right, and then eventually convergence. So both sellers are pricing at 179, setting a price at 179 maintains competitiveness and stability in demand, right? So it's learned something over time with all these experiments. So that's essentially sanity checks. Now we start getting into kind of some new things that are in the paper that were not in other papers when we started this. So what happens when both agents are myopic, and we don't tell them what that means, other than to tell them your discount factor is zero, and we let them interpret that however they want. But immediately you have a collapse. Both of them end up very rapidly, and they converge to the perfect competitive equilibrium price by themselves. And you have to keep in mind they don't know what that price is because they don't have access to the underlying demand model. But somehow they're able to quite quickly converge to the perfectly competitive price just by telling them, you don't care about future price profits. Or actually, we don't even say that. We just say your delta is zero, and we let them interpret it however they want. So this was pretty interesting.
So,
So this shows, fragility immediately. Yeah, go ahead.
so Gary, I have a quick question. So can we go back to the previous slide? So
Yep.
here you show this reasoning, as you mentioned, we all know this kind of like reasoning from the large language models, right? So they are
Yeah.
doesn't really give us causal uh,
Yeah.
implication
Yeah.
because it's basically part of the outcome. They were trained just provide this kind of reasoning and what the answer they provide to be consistent. So
Yeah.
it may not be really, the why they're choosing this pricing strategy, right?
Yeah.
So I think more direct check will be you. I'm wondering whether you have the result on, experiment on just try check whether the machines really follow this Graham trigger strategy. That should be easy
Yeah.
to check. Yeah,
Yeah.
rather than
No, they
just look at
don't.
this reasoning. Yeah.
Yeah, that's a very, very good point. So they don't, but also I wouldn't expect them to because we don't tell them about the Grim trigger strategy, right? Right. So they don't know the underlying demand process. We don't tell them about Grim trigger, and in the economics textbooks, there's potentially dozens of other strategies that they could be using. But the short answer is that they don't seem to be doing that, meaning,
Mm.
I think you'll see in a few other slides, there's more experimentation going on than the Grim trigger would predict. So here, for
But
instance, this is a monopoly
yeah.
setting, but there's
Mhm.
more experimentation than what a Grim trigger would predict. Um, Here, for instance, there's more volatility essentially in the prices. But when they converge eventually, and that's also an interesting outcome in and of itself. Yeah, really good point. Okay, so let me just quickly go over these, kind of the main new insights in the paper. So we look at, the theory-guided heterogeneity dimensions that I mentioned on patient levels and data access. Probability of detecting deviation, we're going to simply map that to, one of the two sellers will not be able to see the prices set by the other seller. And then because we've created this entire framework, we can look at other dimensions of heterogeneity that you can't really model theoretically. So things like, um, what if you put a Q-learning agent versus an LLM agent? I'll explain all of these once we get to the slides. Now, the first one is, what happens when you pair a myopic agent with a patient agent, and the theoretical prediction there in that Grim trigger model was that collusion is harder to sustain. And what we see here is that we go from the red line down to the blue and green lines down here, which is about I don't have the percentages here, but it goes from 180 to 162. So there's a significant weakening of the collusive price. And one thing you should keep in mind is that I'm showing you just one price path here, but we ran this repeatedly, took averages, standard deviations, etc. And this seems to be pretty robust to that. So they consistently end up lower just because one of the two agents is myopic. And of course, they don't know that, right? They don't necessarily know that one agent is myopic and the other one isn't. Just in the real world, you wouldn't necessarily know. But you can look at some of the reasoning, and there's the myopic agent tries to undercut more. Right? It aims to stay competitive, and that causes the other agent to kind of have to come down as well. And then for the data access part, so this is what I mentioned earlier. One agent cannot observe the prices of another. So there are many settings where that is the case, where, for instance, in OTC markets, I used to be, a trader in OTC markets, you could not observe the prices of your competitors. It was like privileged information to be able to get that. Or in auction settings and sealed bid, you don't necessarily know how other people are bidding. So there are some settings where this is realistic. And that as well is pretty effective at dampening collusion quite substantially. Um, and you get it gets even lower than 1.6, so 1.58. So that seems to be pretty effective as well. And there's there's the reasoning side of things, like why does this happen? And just in the interest of time, I'll just show you some of the other ones, which I think were quite interesting as well. So this is something we can't really model theoretically, but if we put an LLM agent against a Q-learning agent, like in the Calvano paper, what happens? And you get this kind of mess where the Q-learning agent is using its usual kind of exploration exploitation strategy, and then the LLM agent is trying to keep up, but it's just getting a little bit lost and even a little bit frustrated. If you look at some of the language for the LLM agent, you can say it's sellers to recent prices have been fluctuating. They seem to be testing lower price points. By setting a price below the current level, I aim to capture more demand. So it's kind of giving up in the sense of like, okay, fine, let's compete. And then here it's capitulating completely. It's saying, all right, seller two has been maintaining a price of 151. To remain competitive, I will lower my price to 151. And so this essentially breaks collusion. You get a lot of experimentation, but on average, you end up much closer to the competitive price just by having these two different algorithms trying to compete in the same market. And then there's the experiment with a number of sellers. So this is hard because every time you add an agent, the computational cost goes up. And so we were only able to go up to 5. And it's somewhat predictable. You can write a theory, the theory around this. So essentially, the more sellers you have in the market, the harder it is for them to coordinate. And you observe this in the experiments as well. Collusion is delayed and then eventually eliminated if there's enough sellers in the market. So I think regulators would probably be really interested in this specific slide.
So Gerry,
Yeah.
sorry to interrupt you because I have
Mhm. Yeah. Go ahead.
it's important result. I have some questions here. So to
Yeah.
me, when I looking at the result, for example, you said one discount rate equals 0, and the other one like is still like a 0.95.
Yeah.
I'm
That was one of the
wondering,
experiments.
yeah,
Yeah.
I'm wondering the result is really due to heterogeneity about the discount rate. Or you just set one guy to be like have 0 patient, purely myopic. Because even in
Hmm.
theory, right, I think it's not because the heterogeneity in the algorithms, in the large language models, and it's really in theory, there's one myopic guy. So in theory, there's
Yeah.
no way to form, this type of Grim trigger or trigger type of collusion.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's just because one row is too low. It's
Oh,
go to
the
0. It's
delta.
not. Yeah, it's
Yeah.
not because they're different. Yeah, the same question also applies to the monitoring. Basically, if you allow one guy really bad at monitoring, then
Hmm.
it's hard to form collusion, even in theory. So it's not really
Yes.
because the monitoring parameters are different. Yeah.
Okay, I'm trying to, I mean, I agree with what you're saying, but I feel like maybe the vocabulary is maybe I'm misunderstanding something. But are you saying that so they have different deltas, and the theory part I showed you says that when there are different deltas, collusion is harder to sustain. Those inequalities essentially get harder to satisfy, which for the experimental study we would expect to see it, but again, they're not necessarily following those strategies, but we would predict that either collusion doesn't happen, or if it does happen, it happens at a lower price point. Um,
So for
so that's what
example,
we see.
it's
Yeah.
very specific. Just look at this plot, right? So
Hmm.
so here the case, the collusion doesn't hold very
Yes.
well, and because one delta moved from 0.95 to 0. So your interpretation
Yes.
is the heterogeneity killed the collusion, make the collusion
The fact
harder.
that there are two different deltas. Yeah.
Yeah, but I think it's not because they're different, just because one delta is too low.
Well, one delta is low and the other is high is the definition of heterogeneity, right?
No, okay, we can, yeah, but you see what I mean, right? So basically, it's just like in theory, it's not because the delta is different. For example, you put two delta both equal zero, even they're
Yeah.
the same, still hard to form the collusion. It's just one delta is too
Yes.
low. It's not
Yes, that's right.
because I think the right, maybe more informative experiment will be, so you have like a 1.9, 0.95, the other one
Yeah.
is like zero point 0.8 or zero point 0.9. They're
Yes. Yes.
different, but it's still high. See how whether they can
Perfect.
still
Yeah,
reach.
no, and I fully understand your point now. Yeah,
Mhm.
you're right. So that was my original. The concern is not that these are not different. The concern is that one of them is just at an extreme value. Um, yes, that's a good point. Now there was a trade-off there because if so, first you have to remember they don't know what delta is, right? So it's not a well-defined model, right? So all we say is you have this, you care about, you have this delta factor, but we don't tell them how to interpret it, what it is, right? And so if it's gonna be close, I don't suspect we will see differences as a result of that. Um, and so there's a trade-off there. You're right that maybe we could try with, let's say, a delta of zero point 0.2 or zero point 0.3. Um, but none of this, right? So, assuming with low, maybe not zero, because that's a problematic case, but let's say delta 0.1 and the other one 0.9, would there still be collusion? Would it still be this dampening effect? And the answer is yes, but there's this trade-off because they don't really know what delta is, right? And that's the other side of this, is that it's not well defined, and they have to kind of figure things out. Um, but yeah, we were trying to capture, extreme cases where, one firm is a very long-term player, the other firm just is trying to maximize, short-term profits, essentially. You're right. So this would be another thing we should add to our list, to our to-do list of more experiments to do. Um, this case is more realistic, the data cutting, because there are situations where you just don't have access, to other people's prices. So this one might be a little bit more realistic. Um, okay, and then the last thing we looked at was model size heterogeneity. So this is another dimension that's specific to LLMs that you can't replicate in theory, or even necessarily in when you're looking at Q agents necessarily. So like what happens when you put a large model with a small model, and we actually find that collusion is sustained in this case. So this type of heterogeneity does not seem to break collusion in the same way that other types did. And we were trying to figure out why. I would take this one with a grain of salt, because what we ended up seeing is that the smaller agent hallucinates a lot more and makes a lot more mistakes. And you can see things, for instance, down here. This is the small agent saying seller's to recent price of 1.9. Considering this price, if I set a slightly lower price at 1.95, it can help capture more demand. So you can see that it's not even consistent with itself, right? It's talking about a lower price, but then it's quoting 1.195 instead of, something lower than 1.9. So this is why this result could just be due to the smaller model just not being smart enough to figure out, all of these collaborative outcomes. This is just kind of a summary of everything we talked about. And then some robustness checks before we wrap it up. We reran this with a closed source model, which is ChatGPT 5 Mini. This is, some you would say could consider it being a little bit smarter than the DeepSeek one that we used at that time. And everything replicates with the closed source model as well, which was interesting. So all the results hold. And then another robustness result is, what if we just tell them don't collude, right? So if you add these two, these three words to your prompt, what happens? And then everything collapses, meaning um, all prices not only collapse, but they actually collapse to marginal cost instead of the equilibrium level. And so the firms are making zero profits in this type of market, which is really interesting just because we added these two words. And of course, this is different for LMs because you can't just tell a Q-learner not to collude. So this was surprising. We didn't think it would be so. If no one had studied just this simple idea before, but it's also problematic because the firms are now going down to marginal cost, and they're not making any money at all. Um, and right. Okay. So just to wrap things up, so what are some implications, and we could open it up for questions. So in terms of algorithmic diversity, now, there's this argument that markets, the firms might always want the latest and greatest models, and they might end up getting the same models as a result. And we're arguing here, heterogeneity is going to be an important dimension that regulators should actually measure somehow. We don't know how necessarily, but the heterogeneity of the algorithms that are adopted in an industry seems to be a good predictor of collusive outcomes, not just in our study, but in the other studies that I mentioned earlier as well. But there are certain types of heterogeneity that are not necessarily predictive. For instance, large versus small models still collude. The discount factors is not definitive based on Winston's comment from earlier. There's still more work to be done there. And then in terms of data intermediaries, this is right in the crosshairs of the DOJ at the moment. What do you do about data? Do you let competitors have access to, information? And if so, what type of information? And the literature is, there's no consensus here. It goes in both ways. There are papers that say, you need to restrict data. There are other papers that say if you restrict data, you're going to hurt demand forecasting, and that could backfire. And so that's a really interesting area of research, in my view. How do you design data policies in competitive markets, and what type of data do you allow versus what type of data do you restrict? And the last thing is, maybe this is a side remark, when you're doing mergers and acquisitions, you're naturally reducing competition when you're merging two companies because you're reducing the number of competitors in a market. But here there's the second order effect, which is that you could also end up with not just less firms, but also firms that are using more homogeneous algorithms now, which might be a second order knock-on effect to collusion that is historically not considered, in these merger reviews. So this might be a new dimension, for regulators to think about, even though it's a second order. Okay, and just to conclude, so in the study, we've spent a lot of time doing computations, and collusion is real with these agents. And we're not the first paper, and I'm sure there'll be other papers that find this result. But what's different in our setting is that we're trying to argue in favor of heterogeneity and trying to understand, what dimensions break it and what dimensions don't. We don't pretend to answer this question once and for all. I think there's a lot of studies and maybe a 10x computation power that needs to be, or 100x that needs to be devoted to this type of problem. I think this is just the beginning of this literature. But it seems like this is kind of the next natural step in this tacit collusion literature is what really happens in practice. And then I'll briefly mention some ongoing work. So we've looked at what happens when there's humans in the loop as well. So we did some experiments with some students, with kind of hundreds of students in Singapore. And what we find there is that there are gender differences in terms of how people use AI, and then that leads to differences on whether you actually find this collusion sustained in lab environments when people are competing. So that's a paper that will be available really, really soon. And then beyond pricing, what I'm personally interested in, this was just a paper with one business decision. I suspect that if firms are going to be outsourcing all these decisions to LLMs, I suspect that type of heterogeneity might also be sufficient to kind of break all of these collusive or the tacit collusive concerns that people have. But this needs to be studied, and it hasn't been studied yet, as far as I know. Yep, that's all on my end. Happy to take questions.
Thank you so much, Gerry. So, any questions? If you have questions, you can just speak out, and or you can type in the chat. I can deliver the question. Yeah. So maybe let me use my privilege. I have
Sure.
one more question. Gerry, sorry,
Yeah.
already it's very interesting work. So that's why I have so many questions. Um,
Yeah.
So here, my understanding, go back to my earlier, one of the earlier comments. I think
Hmm.
here, very differently. So here you just apply some pre-trained large language models in a,
Yeah,
theoretical environment, this large pre-trained large language model, but still you allow them to learn, but to learn somehow to learn something about the environment. That's it. They don't learn to improve their
yeah,
algorithm.
yeah,
So I'm wondering if you also allow them to learn to improve their algorithm, how powerful that can be. I think that's because
yeah,
for many lot of work, right? So including my own work in trading and other works, Cavano et al. In the product market. So basically, there for reinforcement learning, the whole point is they train
hmm,
the algorithm like learn improved, right? It's not
yeah,
just learning about the environment. So here you have this pre-trained but you don't allow them to further improve, further trained by this laboratory environment, and they just
yeah.
learn about the environment itself. So I was wondering if you allow them to, I know for your case, maybe it's much harder to train to do the experiment because it's large language model. I don't know how
Hmm.
it's very costly to do so, but I think that's very meaningful. If you allow them to do it, maybe they can, very robustly to reach, this collusion, even allow for heterogeneity. Yeah.
Yeah, I think you're right. The learning, so it's not that there's zero.
Sorry, Gary. I cannot hear you.
Can you hear me now? Hold
Yes,
on.
it's good now. Thank you, Gary.
It's good. Oh, really? It works? Okay.
It works. Yeah. Now.
So yeah, you're right. That was a good point. It's unfortunate that we lost the whoops the slides here. Um, yeah, so they do learn a little because they can see the market history and but also their reasoning. They can see, oh, this is what I was thinking last period. This is what happened. Maybe I should adapt my strategy. So there is a little bit going on. But there are more bigger interventions we could think of, like let's fine tune these models over time. So we can do that with these open source models. You can fine tune to add a little bit of intelligence. And I suspect you're right. When we move to the GPT-5 model, it's considered a smarter model, and collusion happened faster and it was more severe. So I think your gut instinct is correct. Yeah.
More questions from the audience? Okay. So I have another question, given we have one
Yeah,
more minute.
go ahead. I have
It's,
plenty of time on my end.
it's very interesting work. Yeah. So I was thinking about this. I feel the fundamental logic of here, the algorithm collusion, is very different from this reinforcement learning, this multi-agent system. So there is really under the multi-agent system framework. The whole point there is, well, the system has multi-agent, but you train them independently,
Yeah.
right? They have no idea where each machine has, no machine has any idea, okay, I'm part of the multi-agent system, right?
Yeah.
I think that's the no very beautiful part of it, a very intriguing part of that kind of like um, algorithm collusion within the multi-agent system. It's like you train them together, but no one is aware of be part of this multi-agent system. and somehow they learn. The algorithm will be adapted to the situation they conclude.
Yeah.
But here, you use large language model. It's very relevant setting, but the idea is very different from this multi-agent system training. So it's totally different to me fundamentally. So here is
Yeah.
more like, I learn a lot. The machine learn tons of knowledge concept from the textbook, from online newspapers, and whether they can use this concept they learn from text to guide their behavior in reality. I think that's my understanding. Uh, so they are really after two very different things fundamentally in AI. So can you explain more about this? Because to me, I think that's something very intriguing, the difference. Yeah, and what really about AI we're looking at fundamentally
Y-
here. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's a really nice way of explaining what the core difference is. There's lots of differences between these different types of AI, but you're right that the core difference is these reasoning agents, the language, natural language ability gives them context, and they've been trained on completely different data. Um, right. And like you said, the Q learning agents, like the Calvano paper and all the related works that followed, they don't know that they're competing in a market. It kind of creeps up because there is a firm competing. It changes the way the data, right, the data that's being generated by their exploration actions. The feedback they get is changed because there are other firms in the market, and then they integrate that into the next periods to formulate their strategies for the next period and their exploration strategies. And so, even though they're not aware of it, it kind of still, the fact that there are other agents in the market has an effect on how the market responds, and then has eventually an effect on the exploration that eventually leads to this tacit collusion, which is harder to achieve, in those markets as a result of that. It's more implicit and less direct. Here, just telling them there is someone you're competing against gives them access to this wide knowledge of economics, economic textbooks that they have. And you saw, earlier when I showed just a single node out of these thousands of nodes of rounds that they're playing. In just a single node, they can think about all of these things, right? Completely by themselves, trying to come up with formulas, derivatives, right? They're doing all sorts of stuff, even though they don't necessarily know any of the primitives, right? When you're operating in the real world, you don't know the demand function. You don't know exactly how customers are going to respond to different prices. Um, so that is a fundamentally different approach, and I don't know how you would classify this, right? It's tacit, but it's not tacit like the Q learning agents because they are drawing on knowledge that talks about collusion and integrating that knowledge directly into their strategy formulation and to the price that they end up posting. And so I don't. It's kind of an in between category, I would say, between the purely algorithmic collusion that has no idea other than through the
Mhm.
feedback of prices, and this thing that draws on data that it's vastly different because they can draw on all the pre-training data plus the feedback data. Um, and so, yeah, so these are two different worlds. I agree with you.
Yeah,
Um,
it's but both interesting. These are fundamental questions in AI in general. Yeah, one is multi-agent. You train independently whether they can learn to coordinate. I think your case is more about this big debate. I think very interesting. It's more like the machine is trained based on language, and
yeah,
can this training based on purely language has anything useful in the physical world, right?
yeah,
So, yeah.
yeah. But it is much easier to implement this than it
Mhm.
is to implement for most firms, right? Especially smaller firms. It's much easier to kind of outsource these types of decisions to these bots, and they're doing a pretty good job. Even that experiment I showed you earlier with the Claude bot, eventually after several months, it was actually running a profit. So they are quite remarkable. I don't think the day where small stores are going to be outsourcing a lot of the pricing inventory management decisions to LLMs. I don't think that day is 10 years into the future. I think it's coming as a result of how easy these things are to implement.
Yeah, thank you, Gerry. So yeah, if we don't have more questions from the audience, we'll call it today.